My name is David Carter. I'm the mayor of Falls Church, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to the city. I see a lot of familiar faces, but a lot of new faces as well. So we're really delighted to have you here at Falls Church. This is Mary Ellen Henderson, our middle school and our middle school library. Our librarian has asked me to ask you there'll be no bubblegum chewing tonight at the meeting, but otherwise I think you're good to go. I wanted to start by thanking Corey for putting on such a timely and important forum, and the rest of the folks at ESC. We really appreciate this high level of discourse that we're having here in the city. We've had one of these, I guess, about, 2 months ago or so, and it's a continuation of that series, but it's really great for the city. And also my colleague, Dan Z. Dan's back here. Dan's on city council with me, and he's also has leadership roles in the Council of Governments and also VML in environmental and sustainability issues. Lastly, if I could, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Letty Hardy, who's in the back from council as well. But we have folks in the Planning Commission, EDA, a lot of boards and commissions here, so it's of great interest to us in the city. And it's also very timely, not just because it's 70 degrees in the middle of February, but we're, as many of you may know, we're about to undertake a new high school and also 10 acres of commercial development. So we're talking about maybe more than $500 million worth of development in the coming years. And so we really need to get our arms around how does sustainability, resiliency play into that. And it's not just about saving money on electric bills and the like. It's really, for us, I think, a community value. And how does that work into what we're about to undertake? So I'm delighted that we're having this discussion, and I look forward to their conversation. So thank you very much, Corey.
Thank you, Mayor Tarter, and thank you to our panelists for traveling some distance to get here tonight. And thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm Corey Weiss. I'm the chair of the Environmental Sustainability Council. We're one of many boards and commissions here in the city of Falls Church. And our purpose is really to promote environmental awareness and to advise City Council and the community on environmental sustainability. So that's exactly what we'd like to do tonight. We meet every third Thursday of the month, which is tonight. Our meetings aren't typically this well attended, so I do hope you'll come back in the future. Normally you'd see the members of the ESC up front, but due to the nature of the panel, the event and the venue, they're sprinkled throughout the audience. So could the members of the ESC just maybe raise your hands? There are a few who will be trickling in a little bit later as well. Mayor Tarter has already called out some of the really fantastic members of our community who are here. I also see some people who are sustainability professionals who have a lot to add. We've got Steve Walls from the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. We've got, I think, Bob Lazaro from Northern Virginia Regional Commission's here. So we've got some really great neighbors here as well. So I'm really excited about the conversation that we'll have tonight. Just a quick logistical note, bathrooms are downstairs by the security desk. There may also be one down the hall. I haven't found that one yet, but apparently there is. And if you haven't signed in, please do so on your way out. So the purpose of tonight's event is really to talk about how we can integrate sustainability and resiliency into the development of the West Falls Church Economic Development Project, the 10-acre mixed-use development that will be developed steps from where we are today. We'd like to think long-term about the types of goals that we should really be setting for this development, given our environmental values as embodied in the city's 2040 vision statement. We have aspired to be an environmental leader by 2040. So how can we develop this project to demonstrate those values? In the short term, as many of you may know, there's a draft RFP that City Council discussed at their last Monday meeting, and they'll be finalizing and issuing it by March 1st at the latest. So in the very near term, one of the outputs for this conversation from the Environmental Sustainability Council will be some recommendations for City Council to consider. Good progress on climate change. The mayor last year signed the We Are Still In letter, Climate Mayor's Initiative committing to local action to support the spirit of the Paris Climate Agreement, despite the federal government walking away from it. We even signed, committed to a greenhouse gas reduction goal last year. So how can we develop this project to support those values? And while we've talked as a community about climate mitigation, I think we're in the early stages of thinking about climate resilience. How do we adapt to the effects of climate change? We know that temperatures will increase in this region over the lifetime of this project. We know that precipitation will increase over the lifetime of this project, at least projections are. We'll see more extreme weather. So how do we build this site to withstand, to survive and thrive the physical impacts of climate change? And how do we also think about the financial risks associated with climate change? Because where there's physical risk to infrastructure, there's also financial risk to infrastructure. Credit rating agencies like Moody's, S&P, and Fitch are actively considering climate risk when looking at municipal bond ratings. So this has an impact on the city's financial health as well. How can we manage our financial risk? You know, as a city, we've had conversations about green buildings at a building by building level, certainly most recently with the Onsite project. This is 10 acres, so what does sustainability mean at the site level? What are some of the opportunities with energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, stormwater capture, tree canopy, open space? How can we weave all that together to make a really, truly sustainable site? And how can sustainability drive economic value for the city? There's a lot of research that says that green buildings and green spaces drive economic value, so how can we really leverage sustainable design to contribute to economic sustainability for the city as well, and to create a really special place? So that's why we brought these panelists here today. We've got a really distinguished group of folks who are going to talk to us tonight for about 45 to 50 minutes. We've challenged them to tackle very complex subjects in a short amount of time, but that's really to open up Q&A at the end. So I hope we'll have a really lively Q&A session. Our agenda is effectively divided into two parts. Our first three panelists will be talking about why and how we can integrate sustainability and resiliency into this site. And then our last three panelists will be giving us some examples of communities in our region that are being developed or have been developed in a sustainable manner already. So I'll introduce the first three presenters, have them speak, and then I'll introduce the next three presenters. Jay Wilson, a green building expert from the Washington, D.C. Department of Energy and Environment, will kick us off by telling us about Washington, D.C.'s Climate Ready D.C. plan and what might be some lessons learned for a place like Falls Church. John Pendorf, a sustainability leader from Perkins & Will's Washington, D.C. office. That office was part of writing the Climate Ready D.C. plan. He'll share some additional insights for what resilient development might look like here in Falls Church. And then Mark Ryan will wrap up the first half. He's the National Capital Region Director from the U.S. Green Building Council, and he'll talk to us about the lead for neighborhood development standard.
Thanks very much, Corey. And thank you, Mayor Trotter, and everyone for having us here tonight. So my role at the Department of Energy and Environment is I'm in the Chief of Staff's office, and we recognize that too often we get to the table a little bit late to the conversations with developers to talk about why and how to incorporate sustainability measures in projects. So I work with developers to broaden the impact of sustainability measures, write policy that helps establish regulations and requirements for the city of DC, and focus on sustainability broadly. I'm going to talk about our Sustainable DC plan. So DC has a long legacy of sustainability, and we realize that sustainability isn't a city issue, it's a regional issue. So a lot of the lessons that we have incorporated into the Sustainable DC plan and our sister plans have impacts for Falls Church and our neighbors around the region. The Sustainable DC plan set out several goals. So by 2032, we're aiming to cut greenhouse gases by 50%, increase renewable energy use by 50%, and decrease electricity use by 50%. Those help both with our climate mitigation and adaptation goals. And our Climate Ready DC plan is kind of the sister plan to Sustainable DC. It takes a deeper dive and look into what are the strategies as a region to incorporate climate resilience and adaptation. Clean Energy DC focuses on the mitigation side. So what are the specific actions that we need to do to cut greenhouse gases and focus on reducing the amount of electricity used in the city? It sets out concrete metrics for how much renewable energy to incorporate, how we broaden use of renewable energy, how we look at infrastructure and look at district energy and infrastructure as a resilience target and opportunity for the city. And so all three of these plans kind of give us a framework to evaluate projects and start thinking about how sustainability can be incorporated broadly. So Corey asked me to talk a little bit about why resilience. So DC is part of the 100 Resilient Cities Network. The Bloomberg Foundation has a network of 100 cities throughout the world focused on climate resilience. And they define resilience as the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within a city to survive, adapt, and grow, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. So we've been talking about sustainability for a long time. Sustainability is cutting energy use, cutting water use, increasing the tree canopy, a lot of broad goals about environmental sustainability and how the built environment kind of comes together with the natural environment. For me, I think resilience focuses more on the people side of things. How do we as a community come together and survive an acute shock like a hurricane or an environmental or ecological disaster, or a chronic stress like climate change? And how do we rebound and be better, do better after that incident? So for us, we put together a plan. Like a lot of cities, we're hoping that this plan does not sit on a shelf. We're now a year into the process after the plan was created, focused on implementing the plan. We just released a contract to develop resilience guidelines and focus on how individual parcels can implement resilience. Just a high overview about our Climate Ready DC plan. So we focused on 3 different areas. The first was to analyze climate impacts. So focus specifically on what the impacts of climate change will be on the district. And a lot of those lessons can be applied regionally as well. Look at the risks and vulnerabilities. So what are the specific risks and vulnerable infrastructure and vulnerable communities throughout the district? How would they be affected by climate change, and how can we address their needs and their impacts? And then we identified and prioritized solutions. So there are 77 specific actions within the Climate Ready DC plan aimed at making our city more resilient as a whole. And a lot of those actions can be applied here as well. So just to focus big picture on what those impacts will be, I think we can talk broadly and understand that climate change is going to bring increased precipitation, additional extreme weather events, sea level rise, but also it has an impact to our infrastructure. So if we build last generation infrastructure, there's a possibility that infrastructure could be damaged and could interrupt electric service or utility service for our properties. And extreme heat is something that we sort of understand in theory, but I didn't really understand the impacts and the effects of extreme heat. So I have a slide about that. So here is the graphic for DC in terms of rainfall, the baseline for rainfall, and how we measure and design infrastructure. So we design stormwater infrastructure to a 15-year storm event. That's the green. The 100-year storm event is what we consider kind of a catastrophic incident. That's the blue. So today, in 2017, 2016, I guess when this was done, 2018, you can see that a 100-year storm event is about 8 inches of rainfall. By the 2080s, the 100-year storm event is going to be more than 12 inches, 13 inches of rainfall. So our infrastructure is still sized for the 15-year event to only carry 6 inches of rainfall. And that means additional flooding in our neighborhoods and additional impacts to the life and the way we live, the quality of life in our neighborhoods. Extreme heat. So currently we have about 30 days over 95-degree heat index. And we identified 95 as that point where where heat affects human health. The heat index is the temperature plus humidity. By the 2080s, if we mitigate the impacts of climate change, we can see maybe 75 days above 95 degrees. If we don't increase mitigation efforts, we could see up to 105 days. And that's going to affect the way we experience parks, the way that we sit outside at cafes, the way that we kind of utilize our existing infrastructure, our existing communities, and how we interact with our neighbors. So some things that we can do, incorporate thermal safety into building codes, increase our building codes, design not for the base level, the base building code, but design for tomorrow. Anticipate that building codes are going to get stricter, that we're going to need to think about how to design projects to think about these effects and mitigate them. So we talk about design and a project. So there's one time to get it right. For a new construction project, this project's going to last 50 to 100 years. When you implement that project, that's the best time to incorporate any kind of additional sustainability measures because it costs more and more every day after it's built. We can also flood-proof and retrofit our existing buildings, our existing infrastructure. We also can talk about resilient development, resilient neighborhoods. So designing net zero buildings, incorporating solar, incorporating battery storage, thinking about microgrids and district energy, and we can talk a little bit more about that in the question and answer perhaps, because I'm over time. Nature-based flood protection, so thinking about increasing our stormwater retention and detention, and thinking about how we use streets, how we use the public right-of-way. We don't have to focus just on the building, but the community can be designed and can be useful for the community. I'm going to do this just really, really fast. So here's a development. Buzzard Point is at the confluence of the Anacostia and Potomac Rivers. The vision plan, thought about a network of streets where the development was going to go. But we also understood that this neighborhood, more than most, are affected by climate change. It's one of the top 5 at-risk communities in the district, and it's undergoing a serious amount of redevelopment. We did a study to look at what the impacts of climate change would be on the neighborhood out to 2100, and found that more than 9 feet of flooding would occur at the developments that are currently proposed along the river. So our consultants, Rambo, looked at a network of blue and green streets, a network of strategies to convey water back out to the river, how to absorb water into the neighborhood, and designed with resilience in mind. And came up with this plan highlighting where that network of green spaces would be. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to John so we can have some lively conversation.
I'm also going to stand. I was so green I did not print out my slides. So as Corey mentioned, my name is John Pendorf, and I'm an architect with Perkins & Will. We are a multidisciplinary design firm. I also want to introduce Amy Thompson from our office, who's an urban planner. And she and I actually worked with Jay on the climate adaptation plan for the District of Columbia. We'll see how this works. There we go. So just a little bit about Perkins & Will. If you're not familiar with us, we're a tiny firm. I'm just kidding. We have 26 offices around the world. We do architecture, interior design, branded environments, et cetera, across a wide variety of market sectors. And that includes a market sector called cities and sites for us, which is a lot of regional planning. So things like the climate adaptation plan, as well as large-scale master planning that then translates into architecture projects. And we are a research-based practice, so we use a lot of evidence-based design. These are some of our partnerships. As Jay mentioned, 100 Resilient Cities, pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation. So we are a strategy and platform partner with Rockefeller Foundation, and we have folks working with the cities of Toronto and Louisville right now on their resilience plans. Talked a little bit about the definition of resilience: shock-resistant, healthy, adaptable, and regenerative. Embracing the capacity to anticipate, plan, and adapt. So it's not just being reactive. It's not after something happens, knowing that you did it right. It's planning for what we can actually foresee, predict, etc. And I think, in terms of your development project that's coming up, resilience is actually most powerful when it is done at a systems thinking approach. So one building being resilient, if you can imagine, walls around a building so that no floodwater gets in, well, that water has to go somewhere, and it's going to go onto your neighbor's property, which makes for bad neighbors. If you come up with a systems thinking approach where the entire neighborhood has the same approach, you're far likely to have a more successful resilient design. The why do we do this? We try to categorize the why for resilience into social, economic, and environmental benefits. We call it the C matrix. So we're obviously doing this for sustainability and for long-term health and wellness of the buildings, but also there's a long-term health and wellness for the population that the buildings serve. Knowing that your project is a resilient project actually can reduce stress, situational induced stress for occupants. For economic benefits, what's the cost to bounce back? You know, we have insurance, we have property insurance and things like that, but what about loss of business continuity? What are your tenants or your occupants going to think if they can't go back to the building that they've put so much money, time, and effort into? And we are seeing, as Corey mentioned, we're seeing insurance companies actually looking at the resilient components of a project and using that to provide the insurance premiums and packages to properties. And then environmental benefits. Obviously, we want to mitigate certain climatic events, but we want to bounce back faster after an event, right? We want to minimize the downtime and minimize pollution and waste as we move forward. So when we talk about like at the real estate level, so this is kind of how do we start with resilience? If you're looking for a new site, we talk about what are the chances the site will flood. Flooding is a major issue, and you know, with DC we talked a little bit about coastal flooding, but there's inland flooding too in low-lying levels. And how does that impact the design of the site? Is the site near public transportation? Is it easy for people to get away from the site? And it is located near basic human needs. You'd be surprised how many basic human needs, when you stop and think about it, a CVS or a Walgreens actually provides. But how many places do we talk about having food deserts? So can you walk to places to get some of these basic human needs? If you're looking at an existing building, is there an option for passive survivability? Things like operable windows for fresh air or to ventilate a space. Where are the air intakes? Are they below the floodplain? And then what is the energy source? We talked a little bit already about microgrids. When we did the Climate Ready DC plan, we had three main buckets of risks. There was extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and combined sea level rise and storm surge. That third one probably doesn't impact Falls Church so much, but if we think about extreme heat, things are getting hotter. What that means is that it's going to be less tolerable for us to be outside, and everything is going to require more energy to cool. So what can we do in the design phase? Can we have shade from natural vegetation? Cool roof systems, whether it's a green roof system or a highly reflective roof system, to minimize the heat island effect. And I didn't say urban heat island effect, which is the way I think a lot of us learned it. But the reality is that heat island effect, when you look at heat maps, is growing larger and larger away from those urban centers. On-site renewable energy. So can we generate energy on-site so that we don't have to be reliant on the grid in the time of crisis? And then backup for critical systems, whether that be refrigeration. In terms of the school, maybe there's a health clinic at the school that we want to maintain during a crisis event, whether that's a snowstorm or a terrorist attack. Can we back up that with on-site renewable energy? For extreme precipitation, and we talked a little bit about this already with Jay's presentation, but respecting the floodplain and the water table when it comes to underground parking and basements. Understanding where that water table is, what the precipitation will do to surcharge that, and how we need to redesign some of our underground spaces, whether we have to sacrifice a lower level, for example, to save the upper levels and push the water to a certain place. Again, with water in particular, water has to go somewhere. We can't just wait for it to evaporate. Permeable pavement for roads and parking so that you get more saturation underneath, though you do have to be careful with these extreme rain events for when the soil liquefies, if it's got an extreme surcharge of rain. Avoiding low-lying areas for utilities, so making sure that our transformers and things like that are safely above flood levels. And then oversizing roof drains. If we're expecting to get a rain event that has 3 more inches of rain than we previously were designing for, should we start to oversize our roof drains and our leaders that go through our buildings? And cities like Houston are already doing that now as a reaction to some of the rainstorms that they've experienced. I want to touch quickly on Rely. So Rely is a consensus-based platform. It is a checklist style tool that Perkins and Will developed over the past several years. And It deals with scale jumping. So we try very hard to look at how a project can have a series of co-benefits from one specific strategy. It was balloted and voted upon as a standard. Recently, as of about 6 months ago, the USGBC has acquired Rely, and it will be converting it into a USGBC platform similar to LEED. But it does borrow, and I'll be very quick because I know I'm out of time, but the structure does actually borrow from LEED, so you're not actually duplicating lots of efforts. The idea is to pull from lots of different existing standards out there for building and design to figure out how we can make a more resilient project. And with that, contact information, which I'm sure will be circulated later, but I'll turn it over to Mark. Yes.
Okay, so let me preface this presentation by saying I built it to review as well afterward. We're not going to cover every slide in depth. I am actually the community director for the National Capital Region. I'm not a technical expert, but I brought one with me. Matthew Pujol, who's on our board, works for Sustainable Design Consulting, has done a lot of lead and D projects, so she's here to help also answer some of those technical questions. Who uses lead and D? A lot of different public-private entities use it for the planning of the various sites that they have. It's a system that goes beyond buildings. I think one of the biggest distinctions is scale, as well as sort of.
Could you speak a little louder?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks.
I think one of the biggest distinctions is scale, as well as focus. It's beyond buildings, and it looks like some different sets of criteria around urban planning, land use, social equity, and infrastructure development that aren't always captured in LEED itself. Different types of projects, urban infill, redevelopment, brownfield redevelopment. It can be used for, as you'll see later, from anywhere from sites from up to 2 buildings to multiple acres. It must be a contiguous area. I think this redevelopment project would probably meet all of the system eligibility here, but we always recommend any developer check on what those minimum project requirements are before moving forward with something. What's the business case for doing LEED for neighborhood development? These are some of what I would think of as our standard reasons for it. Proximity to transit, you guys have them actually right here. If you already checked that box. Proximity to jobs, creating higher density, it's more attractive to folks that are interested in moving into the neighborhood. It can raise housing values, walkability, as we well know, it's not only a climate resilience factor, it makes for healthier communities, and it can help raise that property valuation. Why is it the right approach for Falls Church? For one thing, I've just learned that you guys are moving pretty quickly with the RFQ process. So Lead ND is a prepackaged system that can easily be built into the RFQ process for the master developer. Developers are starting to look for it. Investors, especially global investors, see it as an early indication that the community and the developers are really serious about sustainability. And for those who are doing programs like GRES, it's a requirement for investing in buildings and projects. As Corey mentioned, it could improve future credit ratings, reduce that risk, and show that there are already plans in place from the very start of the project to manage those climate change risks. It's the only prescriptive rating system that gives you parameters that are carried out throughout it. So it tells you things like how much green space do you have and how you structure walkability so it's not lost throughout the design process. Another really important factor for LEED and D projects, if you're going to require that buildings that are built on it be built to LEED certification, those buildings will automatically get up to 15 points from land and transportation category. So you're already making it easier for the building developers to build on your LEED and D site. 15 points is quite a lot in LEED version 4. And then of course it reduces the cost burden for those teams. You can eliminate some things like commissioning that typically add to soft costs for development of the project. Why do we need to certify? This is something that we hear all the time, especially with buildings. Why can't we just build to LEED? And I caution you to watch out for folks who start that conversation. First of all, it outsources the verification project for small jurisdictions. We have technical capacity we've been building for a decade. You guys don't need to have that on staff. The major one I really want to highlight is third-party accountability. This is really what we see time and time again as the real value of LEED. We see so many times that sustainability features are value engineered out of a project if it don't have that third-party verification in there and that commitment to sustainability from the very start. And the scorecard gives you a starting point, but if you don't have that impetus, that drive, that third-party review, you're not going to know what you're getting. It holds your developers to a higher standard. We hear all the time, we bought a LEED certified to a LEED ready building, but it was not what the developers told us. So we are that third-party check. And then, of course, not necessarily unique to LEED, but at higher density can raise tax revenue. You're packing in more businesses there, more residents, etc. And plus, it's good for public relations. We come out and we do plaque ceremonies all the time. It's a great way to say, raise your hand and say we are committed to sustainability. There are currently 2 stages in V4. The plan stage, where you have a plan. It can actually be used up to 75% for construction. Clearly, the longer you wait, the harder it is to do. But having this ND plan in from the start ensures that the community's vision is carried through the life of the project. Will it guarantee that you have that level of performance? No, that's why we have the build project cycle. So this is sort of closing the loop. You've set your plans in motion, developers are carrying it out. How do you know that you've gotten it? Well, you go for the second part of certification here, that's the build project. These are some of the benefits for the ND plan. It sets the parameters, it tells your developers that you're serious, and it holds them to that higher standard. And lends for some districts, it can, depending on what the local ordinances are, it can expedite permits and variances as well. And then, of course, it incorporates larger stakeholder engagement that might not necessarily automatically be part of a redevelopment process. As I said, there's credit linkages. So for new construction, up to 15 points, and LEED for homes for up to 15 points. Homes, that's both single family and multifamily. And of course, it helps it be marketable if you're trying to attract developers and investors and new businesses. It's something to say, look, we've got a green community here, and this is how you know it. And if your business values align with our community values, then this is a great place for you guys to be. Moving forward with the built project, again, it helps you sort of set those clear performance targets and make sure that you've achieved them. Automatically grants you 10 points for the LEED homes and linkages section. Again, if you're trying to attract new development, it makes it easier for them to do that if they're built into LEED. This is the LEED scorecard in the categories: smart linkages, neighborhood pattern design, green infrastructure. Again, you can find all of this on the website. There's some links at the end here. Last thing I'll note that there's a number of other systems that we have. The ARC platform now allows building performance to be monitored from the day a building is opened and certified, and it's free for any LEED certified building. We have other programs like Rely, but Sites is great for sustainable sites and landscape architecture. ParkSmart for parking facilities. True Zero Waste is also really exciting. It would be fascinating to see a whole neighborhood development that required zero waste from the businesses that are there. So I'll skip past that, so we don't have to worry about it, but you can always contact us for more information. And there's my email address.
Thank you. Good. I thought maybe I feel like we've trapped our panelists a little bit, so maybe I'll pull this out a little bit. Ew, it's hard to turn around and see the slides from up there. Sorry, this is a new venue for us, so we're not totally familiar with it. If anybody failed to memorize everything on those slides, we will have them available on the ESC's website afterwards. So the second half of our panel is really to demonstrate that what the first half is talking about is not uncharted territory. It might not be business as usual, but there are people who are developing sustainable, resilient communities in our neighborhood. So we'll start with Chris Brown, the Sustainability Director from Federal Realty Investment Trust. And I failed to mention at the outset that Ross Lipkinhouse extends his regrets he couldn't be here today, but he was very helpful in bringing Chris Brown to the table. And Ross is actually in San Francisco at a real estate investor conference where he was at a panel on resilience, so I look forward to hearing from him. After Chris, we'll hear from Vicki Davis, the president of Urban Atlantic Development, who will talk to us about the project at Walter Reed. And lastly, Michael Stevens will wrap things up for us. He's the president of the Capitol Riverfront Business Improvement District, and he'll share some insights with us on the economic value of open space and how sustainability can really drive economic value and create a sense of place. Okay, go ahead.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about sustainability at Federal Realty and about planting some color into what a LEED neighborhood development and LEED development itself can look like. So as we think about sustainability at Federal, there's a couple of really key important things that we focus on. But one of them that really drives a lot of the decision making is how the investors view what are our activities. So we have investor stakeholders, we have community stakeholders, we have employees, and there are all these various factions that sit in the stakeholder side of sustainability. But then there's also the business improvement side, which to me is a big important piece, and it's really about where do we improve cash flows by reducing energy waste and water waste. So Federal Realty is headquartered in Rockville, Maryland, just across the river. We've been in Rockville for 55 years, publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange for the last 55 years as well. And this second quarter of this year marks our 50th anniversary of straight dividend increases. So one could argue that incorporating sustainability is not just putting in social and environmental aspects, but it's also including, business improvement and increasing returns over the long term. So what's good for sustainability at Federal, I think, is also in many ways good for communities, good for Falls Church as they're looking at this development opportunity. And we always think of sustainability as the opportunity to increase our competitive advantage. Maybe it lands us a lease over the shopping center up the street. We think about greater operational efficiencies and value creation through long-term life cycle analysis and thinking about how costs add up over time from replacing building materials that are subpar or increase energy costs. Brand recognition, good for Falls Church as well as Federal Realty. But having a sustainable city is important to DC, and it's important to cities throughout the country. We really appreciate the way that the incorporation of environmental and social aspects really make conversations and relationships with our stakeholders easier to have, more transparent. It's also part of our governance as well. And when you put that together, it makes development and changing communities and enhancing communities a little easier when everybody's working together. And improving employee engagement and attracting talent is important for our company. It's also important for cities. Right? We all want to have the best and brightest coming here. So in North Bethesda, we have Pike and Rose. It's a 26-acre site, incorporates hotel, condo, rental apartments, office, and it all sits atop retail. When I was hearing the stories about resilience, I couldn't help but think, God, it sounds a little scary. All this doom and gloom and building walls, and it doesn't have to be that bad. It can be an extension of your living room. It can be streets that are engaging. It's including, dense tree canopy and giving people a sense of place and a place to go. It can be simple, but it doesn't have to be ugly. We can include native and adaptive plants that use 80 to 90% less water, not a drag on the appearance of the property. We can incorporate resilient features like green roofs. So stormwater retention can be done on the top of the building. Let it release over time. And for our perspective, you know, if you look at the taller tower sitting here off to the side, that's better than looking at HVAC units. You know, so you're bringing that vertical placemaking up and really improving the views. As we look forward, we think about how infrastructure changes, how we have to incorporate what transportation is going to look like in the future. So 3 charging stations there today is a small cry from the hundreds it'll be in 5, 7, 10 years. We can also pretty easily incorporate renewables. Renewable energy seems to be able to produce market rate returns. It is something you can incorporate. Some states lend for better policies and better returns on your investments. Put this canopy on top of the garage. Nothing else makes the top floor of the garage not hot in the summer. And then you get to have fun, right? So you got these green roofs. What can you do with them? Well, we've started turning some of them into farms, and farms that produce tens of thousands of pounds of food. And so that's really great when you can start offering a community-supported agriculture to the folks living in the residential tower next to the building. It gives a better sense of connection to the built environment. And then in closing, one of the things that we had talked about in advance with Corey was what are some of the things to think about as you develop a site like the opportunity that exists here in Falls Church. And you know, Pike and Rose took, good Lord, it's been a long time. We've been actively under construction for 6 years. It took 10 years of planning prior to that. And we still don't know what the last 4 parcels on the site will actually be. Although one could hope, you know, maybe it's a large internet retailer or something like that. Would be great. One of the beauties of the opportunity here in Falls Church is really about connectivity, right? Connecting the community, making the most out of walkable sites, transit orientation near the metro. These are all things that lead to really good in-depth sustainability and environmental impact being baked into a project. And as we think about promoting sustainability and how do you make more of it appear in a development project, you know, some of the examples we've seen throughout the country that have been really pretty beneficial are small density bonuses for building to LEED Silver. We've seen reduced fees for higher levels of sustainable performance. And one of our favorite is always expedited review of your permits and plans as they go into the city. So that's always a nice thing if we can incorporate any of those. Thank you.
Let's figure out how to look at this thing. I'm not moving that. I'm going to move around. If you don't mind. I don't want to have my sitting behind me. Good evening. I'm Vicki Davis, and it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. I brought an example of a project that we're working on that's very special and momentous. It is the former Walter Reed Army Medical Center that's between 16th Street and Georgia Avenue, Aspen, and Fern. How many people here have heard of it or know the site? Ah, good. Okay. It's very typical because it's a very emotional site. Together with Heinz and Trident, our community-based partner, we are developing 66 out of 110 acres. You might say, who has the rest? And the answer is Children's Hospital has 14 acres for a neuro research center and community medical facility, and the Department of State has the rest for chancelleries. We think it's important to show the site in its close proximity to Metro because it's important to us. It's about a 4-block walk, so it's a little bit of a challenge, but it's also on 2 very large bus commuter routes. So there's a lot of of affordable equity there, social equity. Heinz, Urban Atlantic, and Trident are the master developer. We have Toll Brothers as our home builder partner. We have WGL, who is working on a microgrid with us. And so that was only possible because we have a campus that was an Army campus and it was not subdivided. And so we have one whole, and we were able to do that within the rules. This is a little bit of a look at a sense of place. So for sustainability, we think a sense of place is very critical. I think everybody on this panel would agree. It has to be activated, it has to be welcoming for all, and it has to be very well used to support the retail there as well as the residential office, etc. This gives a rundown of square footage. There's approximately 3 million square feet on our side of the site. Between Children's and the Department of State, there is an additional 1 million square feet. This is what it looks like from the air, and what's nifty about it is that it's also a historic district. So it has, is there a pointer thing on here maybe? But it has that big square space-looking building. That's a hospital that was built in the 1970s. We're in the process of tearing it down right now. It's a very high infrastructure cost for us up front because it's the equivalent of tearing down 8 or 9 office buildings. It's quite extensive. But it's a beautiful site, and we're very excited to be there. This is a little bit of a history of the site. It initiated in 1909. It came out of a residential neighborhood, was just small houses. And importantly, and I think this is very important to process, and that's why I'm showing it, 2005, the BRAC process started, Base Realignment and Closure Act. And the city started to engage the neighborhood right then. And the neighborhood worked on this plan through 2013, which is when we were procured. And they came to us with this thing, which is a small area plan. But it's not just a plan on paper. It says, we want all this stuff because we want to vision the community this way. So what's important? Integrate the site with the community, right? A lot of times that doesn't happen. And our surrounding community has a very big mix of incomes, mix of racial background, etc. So it's very important to be welcoming and inclusive of our neighbors. A mix of uses, so it's not just a bedroom community. It's not just a retail mall. It's all things together. Creating jobs and revenue for DC is paramount. Our client is the District of Columbia Office of the Deputy Mayor for Economic Development. So they're most incented to get economic development here. Also activation of the site. I will tell you as well that we were unanimously chosen by the neighborhood. And why? Because we actually went out and listened to them. And we went and we sat on doorsteps and we asked people what they wanted. And it really served us very well because we found out things that they wanted. So if you toggle back, there's what it is. If you toggle forward, there's what it is. It's pretty much the same plan. It's got some really cool resources on it. We have a charter school on here that is the DC International Charter School. They have Chinese immersion, French immersion, Spanish immersion. Really, truly, in a public school setting. It's fantastic. I walked in there at the groundbreaking or the grand opening ceremony, and the kids were racing robots on the walls. Unbelievable. A little scary. This site has a lot of natural resources. This is this thing with the pergola on the bottom is what we refer to as the Great Lawn. Nobody ever called it that before, but it's kind of stuck, so it's the Great Lawn. The thing on the left, the big lawn, is the lawn in front of the high school, so it's very important, and the high school is finishing building a gym onto it. The green area next to the front is very important to our neighbors. Why? Because it has historic trees on it. I will move faster. The area in the north is the town center. Our goal is the city's goal. It was part of the procurement. So this, I think, validates some of the things that you're looking at. Net zero by 2030. Preservation, adaptive use of existing historic buildings. Believe me, that's quite the chore. Green breathers and open space. Photovoltaics on our buildings. So we have a partner with WGL and others, and we're working through figuring out what to put where and how to get our sustainability goals. We also have a DC-specific thing that is a green area ratio. It varies by where you are in the city. Like downtown, it'd probably be a 0.1 or a 0.2. Here, it's the highest ranking, 0.4. How do I get it? By preserving big trees, by creating green spaces, by doing a number of things, by green roofs, etc. We also have a tremendous number of sustainable modes of transportation nearby. We've committed to bike share lanes in all the streets that we're building, and native plants. I'm really rushing. Our sustainability includes energy, water, transportation, construction. These are all the ones that you all think about. But the other one that we really value and consider, actually, and these are images, but what we value and consider is the need for inclusion of the surrounding neighborhood, not alienating people. I can tell you that I personally have been to more than 300 meetings in the space of 3 years. It's a heavy commitment, and I'm not going there alone. So, and our neighbors, 90% of the time, they love us. They hold us, they're all architects. They hold us to unbelievable standards. So we have one of our neighbors here. So, but unbelievable high standards. And we promised the highest level of affordable housing in this community that serves a variety of incomes, not just the least ones. Okay, I'm getting the hook. Activation of the site, very important. Those are visual examples. These are the questions that I feel like I hope that I have answered, and thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Stevens, and I'm the president of the Capitol Riverfront Bid, which is a new growth neighborhood in Washington, D.C. on formal industrial properties. I'm going to talk a bit about creating value from investments in public parks. And it cuts across a lot of different spectrums, a lot of which you've heard tonight. I appreciate Corey and Dan asking me to be a part of such a rich and robust panel. I mean, you can't buy this sort of expertise, and to have it here is really a treat for me, and I hope for you as well. This is what our neighborhood looked like in the 1960s, a low-density, light industrial, light manufacturing backyard anchored by one of the worst public housing complexes in the city. It had a vision based on the Anacostia Waterfront Framework Plan that Mayor Williams and Andy Altman set out that said the river is a good thing and we can transform a community based on that river and proximity to the Capitol. And this is what it looks like in 2016. That picture has changed dramatically in the past 2 years. We're on an accelerated growth. We're 500 acres, 120 is the historic Navy Yard. Our reason the neighborhood was there, founded in 1799. We'll have 37.5 million square feet of build out. This is like a new downtown, but a high density mixed use. We're the fastest growing neighborhood in Washington, and we also will be one of the largest urban neighborhoods and densest in the city. The city invested, was very wise, very smart. They invested $60 million in 3 parks, a gift to our neighborhood to create community, sense of place, and value and identity. And it has worked so great, all of these things. Value is great across the social spectrum, but my investors, who I love all my children just the same, my developers, they want value too. And so they see it does leverage real estate value. It does drive rents. It also creates attraction to the neighborhood. But it's part of our civic architecture. A fundamental building block to have parks like libraries and schools is part of a complete community. We've become a regional waterfront destination as a result of Yards Park, and Canal Park has really branded us as a neighborhood-centric neighborhood as well. 20 years ago, if I'd have told you, and you know this neighborhood at all, that it was going to be branded as family-friendly, you would have laughed at me and said, get off the crack pipe. It's just that remarkable a change, but the water features draw children. This is what we're going to have. I won't bore you, but a couple of things that surprised me. 22,000 residential units, which means we're actually going to have 32,000 residents living in this 380-acre area. Lots of hotels, a soccer stadium is under construction, baseball is there. We're going to have 1.3 million square feet of retail, so it's a neighborhood-serving place. 2 parks are managed by us as the Capitol Riverfront, so we like to call it the Bid, Developer, and City Partnership. And these are complicated arrangements. They take sometimes 6 months to structure and fund, but the city is our partner in this because they have essentially turned the parks over to us as stewards to manage, operate, and program them on their behalf, so they fund it. For city-built Yards Park, W.C. Smith was instrumental in building Canal Park. One is 5.5 acres, one is 3 acres. Total operating budget for both is around $1.6 million. We now got $12.4 million from the mayor to operate those parks over the next 4 years, which saves us some time and energy. We're a 501c6 nonprofit. A BID is a management entity. We created an LLC, so on, but the DGS owns it. DPR is the anointed agency that works with us, and we contract with them to maintain these parks. That's kind of the structural relationship. Yards Park is an award-winning national park, $35 million cost for a city built it. They benefit directly, but the city funded it, and now we manage it. And it's a wonderful example of water features, of access to the river, a marina now, a sculptural bridge, and outdoor concerts and festivals. Canal Park is more of the neighborhood centric, where you come out and this is your front yard or your front porch from your high density condo or apartment building. And it's more environmentally sustainable. It captures stormwater from rain off adjacent buildings on site and adjacent streets, channels it down into cisterns, and it's treated on site and then used for the irrigation system, the brown water in the restaurants, and to make the ice for the ice skating rink. So it really is a model of sustainability, and EPA helped fund this. And it's used for farmers market, concerts. Kids love it. We have public sculpture in it, but they really do create. We had a different funding model than the mayor's, where we were given a series of dedicated revenue streams, but we also were challenged with raising money through sponsorships and events. And you will never cover your operating costs through sponsorships or charging for events. We're not Bryant Park, we're not New York. You just can't achieve that. So I will speak a little bit more about that. Images of the parks and what it means. We have a great lawn, water features, terrace steps. I'm so glad Vicki said something about parks are common ground for everyone. Not only social, but economic, religious, race, families, millennials. They must be gender flexible as well, generational. And have public art and be highly programmable. I won't really go into this much, but we were lucky that the federal government invested in a major public building, the DOT building. It threw off revenues that helped fund these parks as well. But you can see canal parks are more linear. Yards Park is the more riverfront park. And we have, so that we have skin in the game, my property owners have skin in the game, we have to be renewed every 5 years. We said we're going to dedicate a portion of our bid tax to create the capital reserve funds for each of these parks. So I think that's integral as part of the funding mechanism. Our residents love them, our visitors love them, our employees love them. You'll see this when you look it up on the website, but people attend them and use them. These are some of the quotes. It's a backyard for our son. They're amazing neighborhood amenities. Love the parks. They're anchors for the neighborhood. Community foundations. And we program the heck out of these. That is an integral part of any of this as a community building exercise, is to have free events open to the public with music and food and beer and non-alcoholic beverages. We had Jazz Fest, we do exercise classes, pumpkins in the park, you can rent kayaks and boats in it. Our Friday night concerts, we show Thursday night movies, we have a farmer's market. It really instills this sense of community. Many of the elements I've talked about, interactive water features, multi-generational, multi-income levels. Security presence is important to send the message, we're not going to tolerate social misbehavior. This is for everybody. Come and enjoy it, but don't do damage to the parks. A balance between family and millennial activities, and always have a section of the park open to the public, even if you have large festivals that are paying to be there. Some of the things, positive impacts, I won't go through it, but I think parks are the new agora of the American city. As we densify, you need this outdoor space to gather with your neighbors, discuss issues, or just have a bit of respite from the grittiness of the city, if you will. Look at water features, look at the river, but what we have found is they drive real estate, they help us with our residential attraction, they stabilized and then grew our real estate values. But you have to surround them with a vibrant mix of uses, including residential and retail, for them really to work well. But it is a great public investment strategy. I was asked to give you top 5 takeaways. They're essential to creating community. You must, if this is part of your strategy, do a park as part of your 10 acres. Urban environments deserve them, your residents deserve them. You have to identify funding, not only for the design and construction, but to maintain it, operate it, and have a capital reserve. Designed with the community and flexibility in mind. Water features are important. They're hard to maintain, but they're great. They should be programmed as much as possible, but have free time. And then they do leverage real estate value. They've been drivers for the yards development. I invite you to come see it. This park opened in 2010 in the middle of the recession. It has been followed by a huge array of investment like grocery stores, health clubs, residential, etc. We, in fact, did a fiscal impact analysis of our neighborhood. Mr. Mayor, you might enjoy this. I'm sorry to run a little long, but this is important, I think. We have benefited from $1.1 billion of direct investment in our neighborhood. By the end of this year, since our bid opened in 2000, by the end of 2018, that $1.1 billion will have been paid off by enhanced real property taxes, sales tax, and income tax. And you can't read all of this, but by 2040, the city will have harvested $8.3 billion from our neighborhood. So these community building blocks are good fiscal decisions that leverage revenues for your city on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. That was great. So as you can tell, we've really just scratched the surface. Probably each one of our presenters could have spent the entire time sharing their information. But we really wanted to just spark the conversation tonight. So I'd like to open it up to the audience right away for Q&A if anybody's ready with a question.
Capital Riverfront Health, how much is their bid tax over top of the city tax?
What was that again, Keith? Can you say that?
How much is the bid tax?
For my commercial properties, I believe it's 17 cents a gross square foot. Hotels pay $100 a unit. Residential pays $126 a unit. Industrial pays much smaller. Retail is part of the commercial formula. Our budget is $2.1 million, and we adjust the bid tax every 5 years. So I think I have a full-time staff of 7, and then 12 to 14 clean team members out on the public realm every day and into the night, keeping it a safe and clean place.
Thank you.
I want to append to his answer. So our company has built in that bid. There is nobody like Michael Stevens. And the reason is that he gets the 20 plus constituent developers on the board together. He gets the work done. He has everything fully funded. It's run on time, on budget, very well done. And what it does is it doesn't just actually serve the Capital Riverfront. What happens is that people are drawn all the way down from Capitol Hill and even the suburbs to an area that before was prone to flooding because the Anacostia watershed is a very big watershed and there's a lot of water that comes down there. And what they've done is turned something that's a deficiency into a really great benefit. And by the way, you heard that we took away the public housing and we're putting it back, all of it, in mixed income communities. So we took away 700 to date. We have 420 that we have put back, and we're working on the rest.
And I think that was integral into keeping the blended income community, if you will, and bring back some of the original residents who not only rent but have the opportunity to buy units. The neighborhood becomes aspirational rather than warehousing of a lower economic strata. Our crime rates have dropped dramatically. Vicki and her team do a beautiful job of doing blended income apartments. And so the rebuild was a commitment by the city using Hope 6 HUD funds to tear down one of the worst public housing complexes. We do the one-to-one replacement, layer in another 1,100 units of mixed income for sale and for lease product, which I think has been one of the big economic development positioning things that's led to the creation of the neighborhood.
Thank you.
So, when Vicki, you were talking, we got an understanding of kind of where you got your direction from the District of Columbia. I was wondering, Chris, if you could talk a little bit about the North Bethesda project. How did you guys get to the direction that you set? Was that something that the city, kind of set as an expectation, or did you guys take that on yourselves?
Well, Montgomery County, I think, in general, has chosen to be very progressive in the green efforts and the green mission of the county, and underlying a lot of the development priorities is a LEED construction standard. That doesn't require us to do LEED ND or anything beyond certified, but they do set a baseline. And they've shifted that now to incorporate the Universal Green Construction Code or International Green Construction Code, which is a very, very high standard and not well known throughout the country. And so thankfully that is supported by some alternative compliance pathways with LEED. But to answer your question, yes, supporting this is the city initiative. But speaking about competitive advantage, we have built a number of projects where the LEED certification was a differentiator in the marketplace, and we felt it very strongly that not only did it have an economic return, but it had a very good and logical reason to do it for the development itself.
All right, thank you.
In terms of the goals that have been set for you by Washington, D.C. or by Montgomery County in the sustainability realm, what were the hardest and what were the lowest hanging fruit? Maybe start with this.
Sure. The ability to meet a LEED standard in a high quality Class A development is not a high hurdle. To get to a platinum or to a gold level, yes, that can be challenging. But some of the easiest things were the just the incorporation of our normal business practices, the wider sidewalks, the reliance on a sustainable site that's close to transit orientation, it's highly walkable. We believe these are fundamental principles of good development, and those are sort of been the low bar to get to. I think high bar, with when you start talking about the energy requirements of the International Green Construction Code, that can be a pretty high bar. Yeah.
Excuse me. We have multiple layers of requirements. We have LEED ND. We have LEED Silver for all buildings. Rehab, new construction. We have wood frame buildings. Why? Because we're an emerging market, right? It doesn't have the downtown rents that we get in the ballpark, and so there's some cost effectiveness that has to be there in the product to meet the market demand. We have a GAR ratio that has caused some pretty severe stress for us because, typically you'll put up to a 4-inch green roof on a wood structure. If you put more, it weighs a lot. And then you have to build your structure up, and it's like one of those catapulting things. So that's very challenging. But we are doing all of our stormwater on-site retention.
Could you just briefly say what GAR stands for this?
Green area ratio. And if you like to go on the internet, Google that, say green area ratio DC. And it's going to come up with a checklist as long as your arm. And you
set aside some time.
Yeah, you take the area of your thing and you count, of your site, you count all the trees on it, you count all the bushes on it, you count the ones you're going to plant, you count the ones you're not going to plant, you count the areas that you're going to have for drainage. You know what? Jay might be better at this, but I'm an engineer, right? And so I'm a little math geek, and I've been like, oh, well, if I do this, what happens? Well, what if I do this, what happens? And I've been driving my engineers crazy. But Jay, maybe you want to talk about that.
Yeah. So green area ratio was a policy decision that the city put forward. I can't actually remember when the policy was written, but it was an effort to make sure that all properties in the city had green area, that we valued green space within the city. And so there's additional credit for green space at the street level than there is for green space at a green roof that isn't occupied. You can also layer green features on top of each other. So as Vicki was saying, you get credit for the green roof, but you get credit for the bushes that are also planted on that intensive green roof that's part of your courtyard in the building. You get credit for the green roof that's on the roof, but if you put solar on top of the green roof, you get credit for both. So it's very complicated. I think that in some ways, we also have very aggressive stormwater regulations in the city. And in some ways, the stormwater regulations have trumped the green area ratio and are driving more green roof and more infrastructure improvements. So they work in tandem, but sometimes one is more challenging than the other.
Yeah, for us, it also meant that, Walter Reed has been around since 1909. It's got some really big trees on it. And I forget the exact diameter. You probably know this one, but it's like 99 inches in circumference. That's then a heritage tree, and you can't take it down. You've got to build your building around it. So it's a little bit unusual for a site. We've got hundreds of those, and so it's like, well, we'll put the road a little bit here, and we'll put the road a little bit here, and you're trying to accommodate the amazing infrastructure that you're located in. And so we have some parcels on there that have a GAR of 8, and nobody in the city's ever seen that before, but it'll offset the ones in the town center that have a 2. I'm off a decimal, it's like 0.2 versus 0.8. But anyway, it's a very interesting measuring and accountability system, and it allows you enough play that if you are genuine, you'll be able to accomplish the goals across the entire site. By the way, the site is located next to a really fantastic feature. It's called Rock Creek Park, and it's a very important park to the city. Everybody knows that, and so water from this site from the 70s used to, shoot down there and flood the creek, and so we're retaining on site And so that causes us to do lots of weird and unusual things that we otherwise would not do.
Go ahead, Sam.
A question about the Rely standard and lead ND. It's interesting that both now are brought under the USGBC tent. I'm just wondering if you could discuss a little bit more the interrelation between those two approaches. Is one meant to eventually replace the other? Kind of what's the scope of focus for both of those standards?
So the short answer is I don't know. The announcement was just made back in November, and as the community director, I haven't been privy to any sort of the integration and technical comments. I would say if history is an example, there will be crosswalks between the two systems. So if you did something in lead ND, that would automatically get you points for Rely and vice versa. I would say a lot of the various programs that we have through GBCI, that's our sister nonprofit that manages all these systems and certifications, have more and more integration, and hopefully in time they'll all be sharing data through the ARC platform so that it's an automated process.
Thank you. I've heard you speak tonight about a lot about green roofs. I've heard you speak about stormwater management, but I haven't heard you speak too much about energy.
I
solar.
forgot.
Now I saw some solar panels, but I haven't heard anything about geothermal or anything like that. And am I asking a good question?
and so I know just enough to be dangerous, but we have this boiler plant that's on the site and has two big smokestacks on it. Maybe you saw it in some of the pictures earlier. And it used to house this incredibly big boiler. And we're going to take that out. And WGL is our partner. And we have one big feed that comes into the site from Pepco. And WGL is going to take it from that point where it comes on the site and redistribute it across the site. So they were instrumental in having that school get open in August of 2017, literally like 6 months after we had obtained the site. It was crazy, right? And they went out of their way to make sure that that school was cooled and heated as appropriate. So that system can then function with solar, rooftop solar. It can function with cogeneration. It can function with the heat from the heating and cooling system augmenting the electrical that they're buying from the city. And it can potentially interact with our stormwater because stormwater has a temperature to it and all of that. So there's some really interesting opportunities there.
I hadn't thought about that.
I just want to add to what Vicki said. I don't think Vicki gets enough credit for the innovation that is really a part of Walter Reed. And so when the land was disposed and when the private developers received the land from the district, there was a lot of requirements on it. One of those requirements was a microgrid. And so Urban Atlantic and WGL and your partners were responsible for trying to figure out how and why to incorporate the microgrid for the development. And the benefit from the city's perspective is a microgrid or district energy system is a localized energy utility that is resilient, can be islanded from the main electric grid. And so in the event of a power outage, Walter Reed and the parcels that are part of that grid can still remain powered. And so they've figured out how to make each of the buildings resilient in terms of energy, how to reduce their energy load so that they can participate in the microgrid. Because you have to be extremely energy efficient to be part of the microgrid to begin with. And then how to connect all these buildings and centralize a system. And with different property owners, different stakeholders, it's very difficult, I would say.
Yeah.
But it has tremendous benefits. As our energy infrastructure is aging, localized energy infrastructure that's not part of the main electric grid or that is connected to the main electric grid to contribute back to that grid is still kind of an emerging field that we're figuring out how to integrate into the system.
One thing I would add is that it's certainly much more cost effective to design things for energy efficiency than it is to try to pay to power them with solar. If you recall in my slideshow, the garage had a 268 kW system on the roof. It powers the garage. That's it.
Right.
You know, so
Takes up a lot of
if
space.
that garage was even more energy efficient, then maybe we could have got some sidewalk street lights included in there. But the point is that, you know, it's much more important to focus on the energy efficiency when you're thinking about energy and energy infrastructure than it is to necessarily go all in on solar development. And in the more dense urban sites, it's very, very difficult to find practical area to build solar on that site.
And probably geothermal also.
I would just add, you know, and I think that's a great point to design for energy efficiency. It starts when you start siting the building and you talk about low-hanging fruit. We see so many glass cubes in downtown areas, and we're starting to see them in outside of the downtown areas. But the reality is that's an expensive building to cool 365 days a year. So taking a look at the siting of the building, which way is north, south, et cetera, and having the different sides of the building actually respond to the solar orientation of the building, that alone can start to bring your energy use index, your EUI, down, so that you're, by the end of the day, when you're actually putting those photovoltaic panels on, you're actually potentially going net positive. The idea is to really shrink that use down for that building before you even get to how am I powering the building. It's why am I powering the building first.
Yeah, good fundamental questions, right? Things you can solve in other ways.
You know, we don't have a sustainable Falls Church plan. We don't have a climate-ready Falls Church plan, and we don't necessarily have those types of goals for this site. So when you think about where we are in this stage of the process, we're issuing a request for conceptual proposals to hire somewhere around 3 or 4, I would guess, you know, potential candidates who will ultimately be selected as a master developer in the fall of this year. What kind of language or goals would you recommend that we insert in the project at this stage, for example, in the project goals for the RFP, to ensure that we're on the right trajectory to plan for sustainable, resilient energy sources?
So, I mean, I think that sustainable design and resilient design is just good design. And so I think that, you know, the RFP should focus on performance. I think that's where the rubber meets the road. I think we're too focused on checklists as a city because it's easy. You know, there's a pre-packaged kind of way to think about sustainability. You hit all these marks and then you have a sustainable project. And that's really not true. We in DC are thinking more towards how do we structure our regulatory agencies to respond to performance-based codes? How do we make it faster to get through the permitting process by, you know, showing that you're net zero and then proving you're net zero a year later? You know, the best building code would be 2 pages long. I just wrote the 260-page long energy code, and it's not fun. So I think really focusing on performance and asking those performance metrics. You know, what's the percentage of green space, the percentage of park space, the percentage of energy efficiency beyond code that would make your project more efficient? Those things.
I was going to say, you know, one of the things we do in our office when we have a new project from the ground up is we don't pull out the checklists right away, because I totally agree there's too many of them, even though we've authored another one. But I think, you know, asking what are the risks and vulnerabilities, and you don't have to. I mean, the Climate Ready DC plan is great and thorough. We had climate scientists involved, but there are tools out there that can give you a pretty quick snapshot from insurance agencies, from the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, et cetera. Figure out what are the risks that people are saying, and then figure out how the project could be vulnerable from those risks, and then how the design meets those risks. And I think making them measurable and having metrics to benchmark against is really important, because that's where you prove your insurance value. That's where you get your higher revenue from leases, from, you know. So I think being able to prove that you are meeting those vulnerabilities, even at a master plan level, so you're thinking about them, is critical.
I would like to add the flip side to that. So if you're in an area that has $4 rents and you're in a competitive market for construction, by all means, have at it. But if you actually want a building built soonish, like, oh, you know, 2 to 3 years from now instead of 5 to 10, then you have to be practical. And so I would recommend to you that you do what Walter Reed did, what DEMPET did. And they said, we're setting you the base standard of LEED Silver. Tell us how high you can jump. And it was a huge consideration factor in the selection of the developer, right? But it gave us the freedom to play off one thing against another thing so that we would actually have a feasible development in an emerging market. And I think I cannot stress that enough. Please be practical. Trust your developer and work with them to achieve the mutual goals. Sometimes you say, you know what, I just really want all this solar. And then they'll say, well, you want all this solar on your rooftop? Well, then give me a break on my real estate taxes and we'll put in as much as you like. So it's very important to partner with your developer and with your community to achieve the goals.
Yeah, I have a quick question actually relating to the benchmarking. The DC, you have a climate ready framework, right? Now, do you set metrics and performance indicators, and then developers like Vicki would, meet and then get some sort of incentives or award or something, so to sort of incentivize developers to strive and meet your framework?
We would give Vicki an award every day. But so there's a lot of competing priorities. The Climate Ready Plan has specific goals and actions within it that we have to set targets for, and then the Clean Energy DC Plan sets goals and targets for climate mitigation. I think every development is different. I think when we go, when the Deputy Mayor's Office goes to the table and says this is a development project that we want to put forward, every project has a baseline to meet, and then additional requirements specific to that site based on the community that it's in. As a city, we do have the benchmarking ordinance where development projects have to report their energy use. There are jurisdictions out there that have to do more than report, that have to start reducing their energy use, and that's something that I think we can look at as a city and as a region. How do we can't mitigate against climate change without reducing the energy use of existing buildings. So there's going to be some policy requirements on that side. And then on the new construction side, we're continually increasing our baseline energy codes. So we passed the 2012 IECC, the baseline ICC model codes in 2012. They were adopted in 2014. We're now looking at the 2015 model codes, and they'll be out for public comment in the next 2 months. So continually upping the baseline and then lowering for existing buildings, and then figuring out how each development can respond to this context.
There's a really cool thing. It's called the Sustainable Energy Utility. And so it does little grant loan something to help the developer. And we have long-term whole buildings, right? So we can go on the database and I look at mine and I'm like, oh, how's my energy consumption? Because it matters to me. Why? Because I'm paying the utility bill, ultimately. And so, or my residents are paying, and what my residents pay in utilities, they don't pay me in rent. So I'm very interested in collecting the most rent I can, right? And paying the least utilities. And so you can see by product type, who's the energy hog, who's the other one, and it motivates people to go, oh, I could do this and this and this.
And then we're training building engineers to respond and make their buildings more efficient as well. So there's all these different things work together.
True. Go ahead, sir. You in the
Yep. Thank you. My question is for Michael. Michael, I really enjoyed your comments on how the design of the park and the operation of the park are both so important to making sure that the space is dynamic and it brings in the community. I'm curious if on the operational front, you could talk a little bit about what you're doing in terms of the security that you touched on, and also programming. I'm curious if that's driven by the city or if local businesses are also involved in that.
With Yards Park, we had kind of figured out the programming on our own. It opened in 2010, and we started with the Friday night concerts, and the first ones we had averaged around 60 people. Then they grew every year until we were averaging 2,500 people. And we had a BYOB policy, but we had to suspend that because our insurance rates were going to go too high, and the city said, we think you're being illegal in this. So you'll learn as you go along. But the crowds came back. And so we in Yards Park, we have security in the evenings because it's a bit remote. In the beginning, it was remote. It wasn't surrounded by residential. So we thought it was important to have, all DC parks are open dawn until about dusk. In the summer, it's 10 o'clock. So we have security from 7 o'clock at night in the summer till 3 or 4 in the morning, because we feel most people are asleep by that time. But people are out walking their dogs, and they're kind of your eyes on the street as well. With Canal Park, and then we have security during the day on the weekends, because that's when we have the most families and the most diverse user groups, and we think it's just important for them to see a uniformed officer, as well as our men and women in blue, that the park is, number one, well cared for, but somebody's watching that's directly connected to the MPD. With Canal Park, we started doing security from just about 6 in the evening until 1 in the morning, because it is surrounded by high-density office and high-density residential. And we've had very few incidents in either park, little or no vandalism. People, what's amazing about these parks, they come to own them and see them as their own. And it's an extension of their own universe, their own little private living room real estate. So they're very cognizant of that, and people report things. But I think, and with Canal Park, we actually invited the community to come to the table and help us design it, which I think was a very interesting process all around, and ended up with an ice rink 4 months out of the year, and 42 dancing water jets, and then a reference to the canal that ran through the site that little children can play in. It's a water scrim, and then the largest rain garden, natural rain garden in the city, and then open lots for play tots. And it was a very interesting dialogue with the community, and the elderly love them. The families adore Yards Park and Canal Park for the water features, first of all. And they're somewhat free-range parks. Your kids can run around while they're having a drink at the concert, and they're in the water features, and then they're out, and they're dancing on the boardwalk. So it's really big. But what I appreciated most about it was in Canal Park to see the interesting meshing of cultures, of moms on the hill with strollers or nannies coming down, and the kids from the public housing complexes. And they were all playing together in common ground and just whooping and hollering and enjoying being in the water on a hot day. And in Yards Park, we might have 120 kids on a hot day in the Canal Basin. So they're brilliant. They're the splash parks for Ward 6. And I like to say water is magic. And it's, they're not making any more waterfront property. We're blessed with almost a mile and a half, and we have Buzzard Point in our neighborhood, and we're really worried about flooding. And so I'm so glad for the study that Jay had commissioned. But I'm a real believer in parks. And as we rapidly urbanize as a nation, I think they're all the more important to create community. That's first and foremost. But for us, it was to create a sense of place and identity where none had existed. And I think they can be an organizing principle for your new development that drives real estate, but drives a sense of community and community engagement. And if something doesn't work, we used to do something on Wednesday nights, and people wouldn't come. We'd stopped. We went with kids in the canal in the middle of the day, and they come. And dozens and dozens of kids come for the structure piece, and then they go play in the water jets.
Kids would love it.
Yeah,
They do love it.
It's trial and error.
Can you talk more about this concept of blended income housing? How do you get to that, and what ranges are you talking about?
She's an expert.
It depends on the resources that you have. Different jurisdictions have different resources. Different jurisdictions commit different resources. DC, I used to work for the housing agency in Maryland, so fair warning, I have a personal bias towards Maryland, but DC kicks ass. They are unbelievable because they dedicate over $100 million a year. Did I get the number wrong?
Yep, you're right. No, it's a year, 100 million a year.
A year to affordable housing gap financing. So we have tools that are used commonly in the community. One of those cool tools is called LIHTC, Low-Income Housing Tax Credits. And it's a way to funnel it through your debt or through an award to a nonprofit. It's like, have you heard of stone soup? You start with the stone and you add more ingredients, and ultimately it's a very rich soup. It's kind of like that. So affordable housing typically has maybe 8 layers that go into it. The highest difficulty of dive for affordable housing is to be in mixed income communities, because the investors on the market side don't love it, and the investors on the affordable side don't love it. And so you have to have a lot of political will to get it done, right? And you have a lot of resources to get it done. But ours are financed with hard debt, low-income housing tax credits, sometimes 4%, sometimes 9%, housing production trust funds, sometimes a little bit of money that we might get from the highway fund or something. But it's very, very important, because I can tell you, if we had taken 700 public housing families out of this community and said, see you later, it would have been a riot, just like the ones in Southwest back in the 1960s, right? So it's very important to include people. At Walter Reed, we have income bands that we serve. We serve 30% of median, 50% of median, and 80% of median. 30% of median, those folks are formerly homeless. They have special needs. They need services. We always try to integrate our affordable housing, except the very lowest income. Why? Because they need services. They need a caseworker, and the caseworker can't be going here and then here and then here and then here. Has to be in a central location. So our community told us we have more seniors than any other ward in the city. So you will build affordable housing for seniors. And we said, yes, indeed we will. And now, yesterday, we just actually put in our second, we're breaking ground next month on the first one. Yesterday, we put in an application. Get this, for affordable seniors assisted living, which is scarcer than hen's teeth in the United States as a general category. Unbelievable. And then there are other nonprofits that work on the site, So Others Might Eat, for formerly homeless seniors, and HELP, which is Andrew Cuomo's organization that serves formerly homeless veterans, which is very important to the history of Walter Reed. But we have affordable housing throughout our property, throughout the rental, the home ownership. It's inclusive throughout, and I think it's very, very key. Very passionate about that.
I wanted to add a comment and ask a question. Something I heard Jay say and Vicki say about your question about the RFP. I think performance is really critical in getting, because that's going to drive that innovation. How high can you go, or what can you do, is a great question. I would also say, what are the strategic objectives? What are you really trying to accomplish? Is it the lowest greenhouse gas footprint? Is it the lowest energy intensity and the lowest cost per square foot? And then when you move into that whole resiliency from a power and energy point of view, you really got to look at size and scale and say, maybe it's to tackle 20% of our critical load when the lights go out everywhere else in the city, where 20% of our buildings can be that center of the community and everybody can go there. And we know we'll have power because we're generating our own. That way you're just not putting solar collectors out there to put solar and having batteries, but you have a goal to go after. That was my comment. Question, Michael, for you and for Vicki and Chris as well. When you talk about money and appropriations, how do public-private partnerships and private capital, how can that come into play here? Whether it's owning an energy system or owning an advertising space on the football field, which sort of is a to Z, but how do you deal with that, or how have you dealt with that?
Well, in a more limited way, because we're lucky we have the city as a partner, and they get the parks, and this was an investment. And then we have other corporate sponsors like the Nationals, or CSX underwrites our concerts and the security in the park. So they give us around $150,000 a year. And we have found Corona to be a great sponsor for our Friday night concert as well. And they have their own, they have a vendor who has an ABRA license, and we have a controlled, and we have security there to make sure people aren't bringing in and it doesn't get out of control. I think there are companies, just anecdotally for me, they're looking to invest in these areas because, number one, they're cutting edge and they're trying new things. And I think some investors are developers who want to do the right thing. They want to build the prototypes for the future. But our biggest investor was the city, and I think, fortunately, we've had a series of brilliant mayors who got the fiscal footing of the city right, fixed district agencies to where they function at a higher level, and people have moved back in, and our income streams are better, and we now have a $2.3 billion cash surplus, which many cities would envy. And we're chasing Amazon as well. And
20 cities are. I mean, it's down from several hundred.
Yeah. So, which was an interesting RFP process, if you really want to know. So I think Vicki can speak to this more, but I think developers are looking to partner, especially if the city's willing to. I think it has to be a true public-private partnership. It doesn't work if one's taking advantage of the other. And that's where you have negotiations and you talk about what are the stated goals, what do you want to achieve, what's my bottom line, what's my community benefit investment, what does the city want from environmental standards or affordable housing or stormwater management or open space provision or retail provision, because everything we just talked about costs the developer money. So there has to be this dialogue and this open partnership. And I think it really does start with vision from the city. I know my neighborhood did. And public, you're at some point going to make a series of public investments. And how does that best leverage private reinvestment? That's where the partnership truly comes in.
You know, I would add that it, from our perspective, you know, we don't often bring in the private partner or the public partnership piece on including what we think is an essential element of the commerce, of the placemaking, of owning the street. We know inherently there's a return on that investment of having the richer landscaping, the introduction of natural elements, biophilic design, open space is critical for what is, you know, today important in real estate, but certainly becoming even more important as retail develops and changes in the future. So having these natural elements, these park-like spaces are absolutely critical and certainly part of our development plan. I'm certain it's the same for Vicki as well, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
16 acres parks, 16 out of 66. It's a lot. But I would like to kind of come at it a different way. So what creates difficulty for a developer to invest? Because that's the critical thing, because that's what's going to take you the longest time. If I have a neighbor suing me and I get to spend my money with my lawyer, I'm going to be so not anxious to do the deal. We're lovers, not fighters, and so no. So buy-in is very important. Early infrastructure. So what happened in the waterfront is there's a great big building. It belongs to the United States Department of Transportation, but doesn't really. It belongs to JBG. And the taxes that are X a year, which I don't know, so X. Somebody leveraged those to build the park, the infrastructure, the things that don't bring early returns for developers. I've been working on Walter Reed since 2013, and I haven't collected one dime, not one. And that's very difficult to finance. It's one of the reasons we have a very large partner. They're called Hines. And so it's very important that you plan ahead and you don't create uncertainty for your developer, because otherwise you're going to shrink the pool of people who would do that, right? And you might not get to the end product, which is actually to have development as opposed to no development.
I think predictability is key, not only in what you want, but in permitting and how that you deal with everything in every agency that they're dealing with, and then predictability from the local community. There has to be a significant amount of buy-in from very early on. My neighborhood, I was fortunate in that there really wasn't anyone who lived there except for Arthur Capper. It was 50% vacant, and we knew it was going to get rebuilt because of the Hope 6 grant, but we essentially had a clean slate. So if you're in the business of rearranging the pieces on the chessboard, of relocating people and inviting them back, or relocating a school, it becomes a bit more complicated. I think the development environment in this region is extremely competitive. And so they're all using cutting edge practices across the board because that's what they have to do. They're not only good business people and they want to do it, but that's how they compete with other neighborhoods that are doing excellent work. So I think having an open and honest dialogue from the beginning and letting them know what your expectations are, what you're going to bring to the table in terms of any public finance for basic infrastructure or tax abatements, that sort of thing is important. Mm-hmm. And then make sure they have an understanding of what the entitlements are that they're going to be able to exercise that affects their bottom line.
Kate, I wonder if you could bring up the presentation, Vicki's presentation from Walter Reed, and just skip to the sustainability goals, because I think those were set at the outset of this project. Right?
We proffered them at the beginning. We offered those. And we are so weird as a company
Enlightened.
now we're pretty weird. We actually started an energy company back in 2008. And what we did is we talked the DC government into property assessed clean energy. And it was passed unanimously. I don't even know how that happened, right? It was not my initiative, it was one of my partners. And so what does that do? Well, it gives the ability for the city to finance energy improvements on just about any building. Old ones, new ones, solar, blah, 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 whatever. And so there's real innovation there. Maybe this slide, do you have that one?
I'm having a hard time clicking it.
Oh.
Hold around. Go the other
Point
way.
it to the computer. It's pretty far back. I would guess it's
back. Well, it's changing.
Okay. Okay, never mind.
I
So
broke it.
I'll tell you what this says. I would
That was the
never
last
be able to read this from a distance. This says energy as our first thing. Microgrid, whole and tri-generation, because we thought we had that boiler plant and we could do some stuff there. It becomes more of a challenge, and I want to talk to you about that. Photovoltaic and solar. So we build a lot of multifamily. And maybe you all live in single-family homes and you have a furnace and you have an air conditioning unit and it's got a compressor outside and you've got a split system or a heat pump or something like that. Well, that's what we build too. And by the way, that's what 90% of the people in this area build. The school has a 4-pipe system. I don't know if this building has that or not. It doesn't have any vents. It's all pipes with fans. It's a very high premium. We have one other building, happens to be an affordable housing building, and we got a contractor who did commercial development to do it because he knows how. So not everything is so easy as you might think. Water, we have green roofs to hold our stormwater on site. Bias wells, which is along the streets to hold back the water flow. Cisterns, which is for storage of water. Some of those are like these really big pipes that are like as long as this room, and they're kind of buried beneath the driveway, and they hold the flood water until a certain period of time, and then there's an overflow and lets it out. Then there's transportation. So we have public transportation nearby, and we'll put the Metro bus right back through our site. We have alternative forms, bikes, walking, electric charging stations. I think transportation is going to be the biggest green area in the future. I really, really do. I think autonomous cars are coming. You can call me crazy, but I think it's coming, and I think it's going to change the way that we develop. Construction, LEED silver, recycled materials, and local resources. Those are kind of requirements that come forth because of LEED, and so it's part of what we offer. The social engineering part of it is a very big part of our sustainability as well.
Go ahead, Andy.
As Falls Church considers this development opportunity, how would any of you recommend that our community ensure that we are planning for a successful, sustainable, and resilient project, not just for the next 5 or 10 years, but for 20, 30, 40 years? I think we've already heard about the sort of the imperative that climate change presents and extreme weather and the need to plan for that. But I think Vicki just mentioned something I was thinking of: autonomous vehicles, changing patterns of transportation, perhaps of retail, of work habits, and even neighborhood formation. So how do we plan for something that remains sustainable and viable and successful decades in the future?
Zoning that allows for flexibility of uses. I think it's as you think about developing a site or developing a section of a city, it's very difficult to say what when you start the planning process this year and you start looking for tenants in 5 years or start trying to sell condos in 7 years. You have to have a lot of flexibility in that because the world's changing. It's changing quickly. Autonomous cars, maybe are 3 years out or 30 years out, but somewhere in that range. But everything else is changing that quickly too, right? So you need to have a lot of flexibility. But I think you underpin it with something knowable that sort of allows for this, allows for sustainable and resilient design. I think you can set yourself up for the future very well.
I would also look, in addition to a zoning code that designs for flexibility, because designers love that flexibility. Look for trapdoors and problems that might impede being able to be flexible. One example is a lot of municipalities still don't allow for full use of rainwater capture and harvest and reuse. But if we're hearing that you're going to have thousands and thousands of gallons of water that Vicki's has to put underground because we have to do something with it, why not capture it for reuse, which cuts down on your utility bills because you're not using clean water, but also allows you to do something with that water before surcharging it into the greater community. So if the zoning code or your local building code doesn't allow for things like that, start working on that now as well, or provide developers the flexibility to experiment with it and prove that it works. We had a project very far from here, albeit, but in British Columbia, where we actually had to take the water to the local water lab to show them that it was actually cleaner than their drinking water after it went through the reverse osmosis process. You couldn't tell the difference, but the city outright wouldn't let us do it. Likewise, we've had projects here where we've wanted to do waterless urinals, which some people love, some people hate. We had to put the pipes for the water in the wall to pass inspection because that particular municipality said was determined that the waterless urinals were going to fail. So understanding where those types of problem areas are, I think sets you up for the future for greater opportunity.
I'd also say raise, oh sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Under Canal Park, there is a very big collection reservoir. I have the first building under construction now that's going to put my stormwater into that, and I have to pay them a big fee, right? But how do they, yes, thank goodness, yeah. We're so excited about that. But I'm paying that instead of having paid for a capitalized stormwater structure of my own. So it's a part of the whole. And you hope that you come out even, because the one thing that you don't want to do is put me at a deficit for doing good stuff, and the guy right next door is like pumping out money because he didn't have to do anything. So you have to be very fair and very targeted. The other thing that I would say to you is, put your money where your mouth is. That park, that canal park, they raised like $30 million of new market tax credit, part of that stone soup, non-traditional resources to build that park, right? So very important. If it's something that you really believe in, then fund it. And any developer in their right mind would take advantage of it because it improves their value as well.
I would say you have a 10-acre site, I think, adjacent to the metro. I think that's a really great opportunity. I always say density, when well planned and well executed, is a beautiful thing. And so I would encourage you to have a flexible enough zoning code that allows a mix of uses and stacked, because you don't want it segregated, you want it integrated on site in a big way. And I would suggest you go do some best practice travel and look at some other similar sites that are 10 to 20 acres that have been built. I'll name 3 in the district. The City Center right in downtown Washington, Hines, the developer on that. O Street Market by Roadside Development up in Shaw is just a brilliant project with a lot of environmental sustainability elements. And it dealt with an older population and repositioning a grocery store and having a hotel and high density housing and great connective open space. And I would visit the Wharf, which is the big daddy of them all, which was a local developer that lost its major partner, and Monty was in for $50 million of upfront costs before Madison Marquette came in, and then a Middle Eastern funder as well. But they did some things incredibly right from an urban scale standpoint. And then always remember, the site, this 10 acres, is not going to exist in isolation. It's got to be connected through bike trails, through pedestrian alleys and walkways, through access for autonomous cars. It has to be connected to the metro in a very meaningful way, in a very beautiful way. And they, I always say they're vertically integrated, but you have to have some integration at the ground plane as well. And that's through streets that serve as linear parks, or plazas that are surprises, or a very defined 1 acre open space. I mean, if you want to see a small space working well, go to Paley Park in New York City and see how that works. But grand doesn't mean it's going to work. It's well designed, it's flexible, and it has value with the community. But you've got to be connected to the surrounding areas, so people will be coming in like water, and then your folks are going out as well. You can't exist in isolation. But this 10 acres adjacent to a metro is a godsend.
And I think Mark overlooked. You should probably come to Pike and Rose and see our Rose Park. Maybe have dinner.
Yeah. I think
Brendan Park.
Go to Bethesda Row, go to Pike and Rose, go to Silver Spring.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, just a question building on the last one. We saw in your presentation, Jay, that you were taking into consideration future climatic projections with regards to rainfall. I'm wondering if that's standard practice these days, and I'm also wondering if that extends to flood mapping, because my understanding is in the FEMA flood maps, they do not take into consideration future climate change, and I wondered if you care to comment on that.
Sure. So no, it's not standard practice. I think it's something that more communities should look at and focus on. There are some innovative architecture firms like Perkins and Will that do focus on that and talk about, do a resilience checklist as part of the design. But I don't think you necessarily need the study to understand that these future climate conditions are going to affect your property. So I think there are some things that you can do without a climate-ready DC plan to start asking for additional performance, additional rainwater harvesting and reuse, stormwater management requirements that add to the character and the beauty of the neighborhood that also solve a purpose. So it's something that hopefully more communities will do in the future, but we're not there yet.
The question also about FEMA flood maps. There are other tools out there that are actually very user-friendly. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has one that helps to map some of the projections. Some of them you have to sort of play one against each other, and I think a little bit of information can be dangerous, but there are other tools out there besides the FEMA flood maps. The problem is that a lot of insurance standards are still only tied to the FEMA standards. So it's also a conversation when you get to a large scale of can you convince somebody that another standard is just as valuable.
So, Michael, you talked a lot about the importance and centrality of the metro, of parks, of integration in terms of pathways. I haven't heard anyone talk about the symbiotic relationship with the schools. So I'm curious, I don't know if any of those 10 to 20 acre examples included a school. I know, Vicki, you mentioned the school. So I'm curious what we should be thinking about there, and also from the point of view of opportunities for instruction, education, integration of learning and real-time learning, with the textbook being, that actual community and the systems that you talked about.
Our neighborhood is growing so fast and appeals to families so much they reopened Van Ness Elementary School and invested $14 million in its renovation and added floors and rebuilt the systems, and it's a pre-K through 5 and built a playground, so it's a huge piece of our civic or social infrastructure, if you will. And they're already saying, when are you going to build another school? So I think it's very important to do schools. I do think having learning centers is important, and libraries can serve as learning centers. I think libraries still have a place and a role to play. They need to evolve and be technology friendly, but I think job training is going to be such as people have to change careers. And so I think having that as part of a learning center is great for your community and another civic role you can play. So I do think civic infrastructure is imperative. Daycare centers are so important. We're struggling to try and land a few. I've got a church that wants to do a daycare center, which I'm highly supportive of them doing that, and they want to add density and put apartments in. So there are a lot of interesting combinations out there. And I think our city for a while overzoned retail, and so we have some vacant spaces downtown. So they're new theories on third place spaces, which libraries are that, or conference meeting rooms, or art galleries, or learning centers, or all of those are third place. They generate activity. What you don't want is blank walls and vacant retail space. So part of this would involve perhaps a market feasibility study, is to really tell you what you can support as a community. But if you're going to layer in some density, that solves a good many problems, if you will. But I think the mix of the uses and really incorporating civic is important.
Just add to that. Somebody mentioned or asked a question earlier about public-private partnerships. And there's an example of a development in DC, which was a public-private partnership between the city, an affordable housing developer, and a market rate developer. And so there's within 2 blocks of each other in Foggy Bottom, there's a fire station on the first floor. There's deeply affordable housing above that. And then the next block over, there's a library on the first floor and very expensive market rate condos above that.
That was East Bank.
East Bank, yeah. And so, right, a squash and a squash bar. So, thinking about the schools or a library as, another opportunity to enliven the first floor, and you could maybe put housing above that and save some land for park space that activates the community. There's different ways to kind of structure the entire master plan to figure out how these would work together.
And sustainably designed communities are a teaching space in and of themselves. You could walk around, you could point to all the different features. I would say LEED also incentivizes developers to use what they've accomplished through signage and educational points.
Don't forget the arts. I think it's imperative. And I think many developers are looking at including theaters, black box theaters that flexible space, but they're also looking at including schools. As part of the program, there's a developer that built a hotel in Southwest that put a fire station in the ground floor. And people could stay in the hotel above it. How innovative is that? And cool is that? So I think all bets are off in terms of this combination of uses. We've, as a country, did a great job of segregating uses and putting things apart from one another. And I think people like a little bit of the messiness. They like turning the corner and seeing the fishmonger or the bread person or the flower maker. It's all urban. It's cool.
Okay, I think we'll probably take one last questions unless there are any. Is there something back there that I'm missing? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Michael talked about the competitive nature of the real estate market here. This particular site is going to be very competing with a lot of really exciting spaces around Northern Virginia and elsewhere. Will you be able to differentiate a space like this without incorporating all these sustainability features, and how deep you need to go to really have this as a distinguishable development space that's going to be there? I mean, how deep do you have to go into there to really make it so that it is a differentiator for this particular place, which would then allow a lot of these values that you're talking about getting with higher amounts of development, greater money, throwing off greater money to the city. So can you do it without that, or do you really need to grasp that fully?
I think our 2 developers ought to respond.
I'll take one swing at it. I think if you try to incorporate very, very, very deep levels of sustainability, it probably can't be built. There becomes a point where when you layer too much in, you have to build it for a return, and you can't. So, I mean, there's a balance that you're going to strike there, and there's limits to it.
You might not be doing sustainable living building challenge or well.
But you, the taxpayers, could be instrumental. If you really believe in something and you want to see it and you know that it'll make your community better, and it will, then for goodness sakes, invest in it. The upfront money is the hardest thing for the developer to come by. If I sit here and I say, oh, I have a return of 6.5 over here, and then here I have all of these special requirements, and it's going to create uncertainty, it's going to cost more time, and oh yeah, my return's going to be 6. I'm like, 6.5, 6, 6.5, 6. And the ideal place for that 6.5 one is right across the street from the guy who's doing the 6th one, because he's taking all the risk and I'm getting all the benefit. And believe me, that happens. So be conscientious of, if you want something, be willing to pay for it. Could be in land sales proceeds, could be in non-traditional resources, could be in taxes, could be in any number of things. Density. But density bonus, yeah. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I would say density bonus in an emerging market, no, doesn't work. And I can explain that, but not here. So, yeah.
But just to be clear, so for both of your projects, Pike and Rose, Walter, your communities did set sustainability goals for those projects, and DC certainly has a robust plan. And if we look to the goals and the policies, those projects are achievable, right? So it's doable. And I guess the question is, do we lose a competitive edge if we're not striving for innovative sustainability goals within the range of financially viable and technically feasible?
I think you have a cultural shift. The millennials are driving a lot of real estate decisions, and I think they like having environmental sustainability embedded in projects, and they expect it. And so I think it's part of responding to the market. It's part of being in harmony and balance with nature. But I think to be competitive with this large demographic, large country, then you have to exercise environmental sustainability and responsible development.
I was just going to say, you know, the DC metro area, which would include this community, is one of the most educated in the country. And I think you also have to realize that if you're not building, I'm not saying you have to be LEED Platinum or WELL or living building, but if you're not building to some level of benchmarked sustainability, the community will ask why. And I think if you could, especially if you can show the return on investment for doing it the same here and here, but this one's LEED Gold and this one's not, we have, I mean, it's in the district in particular, you're seeing higher rents for more sustainable buildings because, and it's not, it doesn't even have anything to do about the energy efficiency or the cleaner air. It's because people want to do that and be associated with that. So I think there is a market edge. It's finding that sweet spot for how to make it financially viable as well. Nobody wants to be the last brown building, right? You want to be in a green building. Well, we don't have a color yet for resilience, but if you're building on a hill and you've got lots of snow melt coming down, nobody wants to be at the bottom of that hill come springtime, unless you've designed it so that the water goes around your property or the water gets incorporated into your property. So I think you're dealing with a highly aware population that you need to meet them where they are as well.
I would also just add to focus on the long-term goals of the community. And so this entire realm is changing so rapidly. So the goals that you set for the first project, the innovator that comes in and starts the development here, are not going to necessarily be the same goals for the folks who come in and end the development. You know, there's going to be a time lag. This project might meet this level of efficiency or sustainability. The one that's built 5-10 years from now might need to be net zero because the rest of the market is already there. And we're seeing that in DC. As buildings are changing, communities are changing, there's a lot of focus on what comes next and how we can put that into place within the RFP or just in the way that the community talks about development.
That's a great way to wrap it. So we're a little bit after 9. I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Thank our panelists.